Based on what you and Will are saying, I feel like maybe Foucault just has like an utterly corrosive effect on like emancipatory struggle. Like, hello, this is What's Left of Philosophy. I'm Owen, and here with me today is Lillian.
Hi.
Gil.
Hello.
And Will.
Yo.
So for today's episode, we're talking about Foucault. Foucault's work is often broken up into different periods: the structuralist, so-called archaeological period of the mid to late 1960s, the period focused on disciplinary power and the birth of the prison in the early to mid 1970s, the biopower and governmentality period of the late 70s and early 80s. We're not even going to try on this podcast to provide a synoptic view of his work and thought as it develops and transforms through these periods. Instead, we've decided to focus our discussion around two lecture courses Foucault delivered in the early 70s while he was preparing and drafting Discipline and Punish in a post-68 intellectual milieu that was dominated by Marxism and Althusser's thought in particular. The first course is the 71-72 lectures on penal theories and institutions, in which he analyzes a popular revolt in 1639 Normandy and the repressive systems of anti-sedition that developed in response to that revolt. The second course is the 72-73 lectures on the punitive society, in which he analyzes the larger social antagonisms that provide the macro context for his account of the so-called microphysics of power that he gives in Discipline and Punish. And he proposes to call these social antagonisms, of which class struggle is a central case, civil war. This whole period of his work, which ends roughly in 77, sees Foucault preoccupied with what's been called the war model of power relations, in which he tests the explanatory power of different hypotheses for understanding social and political antagonism. Power as social war, power as civil war, power as race war. I think he's trying to appropriate, expand, and jettison aspects of the Marxist concept of class war in this period of his work. So given that we plan to discuss Foucault's fraught relationship with the left, his work from this period seemed to me like a good launchpad for that discussion. So I thought I'd start by asking if this Foucault, like from this period, these lectures, strikes you all as a bit of a different Foucault than the one we hear about a lot these days, or is this just more of the same from the postmodern neoliberal CIA op?
Well, okay, we're going in hard, huh?
So I just finished reading an article about how the CIA was super down with like Derrida and Foucault and wanted to see departments in the US be taken over by that stuff because it made the left much more anodyne and harmless than like Marxist like class war perspective.
Owen's in the paint. He's in the paint.
Okay, so I didn't realize we're going to begin with dunking.
I mean, come on. I assumed this was going to be a bit of a dunk fest, and I was gonna come to our guy's defense, but I guess I've come out swinging a little bit.
Yeah, coming out swinging. Yeah.
You're antagonizing us.
True.
Well, I mean, so on the one hand, like, I get why there is this perception of Foucault as, like you said, kind of, it's more anodyne than like direct invocations of class antagonism in some ways. But this early 70s stuff is interesting in so far as he's like actually very willing to discuss the formation of like antagonisms in class terms and like trying to think kind of carefully about the relationships between like this sort of nascent bourgeoisie. It's like, you know, the early 1600s, this revolt, the New PA that he's like looking at, and like that it's a revolt against the imposition of certain taxes that are like levied precisely against a kind of, you know, a poor, you know, working class, that like is the occasion. There's a way in which he can't avoid being very sort of class focused because of the object of analysis, which is really interesting. And it is, on the one hand, you asked the question, is it continuous with or a break from the Foucault? I know, like, it's kind of both. you know? Like he's very careful and sensitive to these relationships. But because of like the specific character of this revolt that he's talking about, he can't avoid thinking about these economic and class relationships in ways that he can elsewhere.
Wait, who's the Foucault you know? Like when you're like, it's kind of similar. It is and it isn't similar to the Foucault. Is this the CIA op Foucault, or is this? I'm just trying to get clear on what all of our Foucaults are.
I mean, my favorite Foucault is the discipline and punish Foucault. That's my favorite Foucault for sure. I'm also like familiar with the like birth of sexuality stuff, and I do think about him in these terms. I don't have much to say about like the 60s Foucault, the earlier, more sort of formal, discursive, structuralist Foucault. Like the archaeology of knowledge is impenetrable to me. My brain can't get it. So I think of the mid-70s stuff as being the Foucault I quote no, I guess. But then again, he's been taken up in all these like ways, mostly coming out, I think, most influentially out of the history of sexuality, I think is like the most influential Foucault.
Yeah, I think a bit of like important context for this Foucault, because this is the Discipline and Punish Foucault. He was drafting, even though Discipline and Punish was published in 75, like he was working on it and drafting it like while he was delivering these lectures. But I don't know, I guess for me, there are certain kind of caricatures of Foucault, which are maybe, I don't know, they're kind of also partly accurate. Like the later Foucault, where Gill's always making jokes about how Foucault in that period is obsessed with like Roman gymnasts and, the care of the self, the praxis of the self stuff. But more just like the kind of like power is everywhere. It's super ubiquitous, and so it's equally nebulous kind of Foucault. You know what I mean? Like, and resistance likewise is also everywhere or whatever. That somewhat of a caricature, but also partly accurate view of that later Foucault. I just feel like, and maybe as a bit of context too, it's important to acknowledge that this is in the early 70s, like Foucault's kind of one period of his life, or maybe the most politically militant period of his life. And I don't want to exaggerate the political militancy we're talking about here. I mean, he was involved in this group called the Group for Prison Information, in which they tried to like disseminate accounts of prisoners themselves, the GIP, disseminate accounts of prisoners themselves, their experiences in prison. And he was involved as an activist. And there were some other like French intellectuals from that milieu that were also involved. But I don't know, this just strikes me as a period in which Foucault is less kind of caught up in the tiny minutiae of historical analysis that he sometimes seems to be drawn into in other parts of his work. And it's actually giving us some like stakes, some like big like macro stakes. Okay, like why is there a prisoner penitentiary system? Well, the bourgeoisie needs to deal with this problem called sedition. There's a class here that has a certain problem, and this is the explanation of how. I know Marxists tell you that class war is the motor of history, but this is actually how these institutions, practices were set up in order to individuate, serialize, disempower. This is the one place, for me at least in Foucault's work, where I just feel like the stakes are really palatable, right? He's trying to give an account of what a particular class tries to impose on another class to try to explain how it is that the whole system, the whole penitentiary and punitive system we live under is not just a set of historical contingencies, but actually part of a concerted effort by a class to impose a certain order and to undermine the potentialities for sedition in that order. And it just, you don't hear, at least I don't think, I'm not a Foucault expert, but you don't hear Foucault in most of what I've read giving us such like palpable historical and political stakes for the things he's analyzing. You pick up Discipline and Punish and you get right into the kind of microphysics of power, the shaping, the panopticon and the shaping of subjects and the shaping of the reform of the soul and all of this. But this stuff, I mean, you get a better sense for like, well, why is all that happening? Like, why are these new systems of power being implemented? Well, there's a kind of class antagonism story that needs to be told in order to understand the kind of macro context for that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and so what I actually really enjoyed about these lectures, and I think I might be a bit warmer to Foucault than others on the left, is sometimes the way that I understand Foucault, the caricature of Foucault is it turns him into this grand narrative of power is everywhere, but for some reason there's also resistance within power, and you can just deploy Foucault in whatever context that you want. But Foucault here is not trying to give some grand narrative. So sometimes there's a way of understanding a version of Marxism that wants to give a grand narrative of class struggle is the motor, and whatever context you come up with, the shape will look different, but I can tell you how it works. But here we're getting specificity, like when he starts talking about the emergence of the criminal. I think that there's something really helpful in foregoing the need to give a grand narrative and say, so how does this specific institution emerge, and what problem is it trying to solve, or who is trying to use this institution to solve a particular problem to stabilize a new type of order. So rather than giving us a sort of metaphysical claim, what can seem like a metaphysical claim about here's what always happens, instead we can ask specific questions. So what is crime? And I know we don't want to say crime is completely socially constructed, but we want to ask, well, how did this become a type of practice in view of what? If we don't assume that the figure of the criminal is simply something natural, like he gives this story of how what changes is even if the victim of a crime doesn't want to press charges, the criminal is a threat to the state or the public itself.
It's a social enemy.
And so this is a new form of the public where the public can say, regardless of your individual stake in this crime that happened to you, it is in the state's interest to still prosecute it. And that is, a different configuration of a set of relations that allows you to understand, like, oh, that is actually a shift that helps me understand. So what is going on with the criminal if it's not only about sort of it was immoral what you did to this individual, but the criminal stands as a sign of a threat to the coherence of state discipline. And I think that is something really illuminating to see, to allow you to see shifts rather than having a narrative that you just sort of cookie cutter put in and explain everything.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting in this context that he's able to cite early modern juridical practices where the king, the sovereign, the monarch would come face to face with the criminal. And because it is, as you say, no longer a harm done to an individual, but rather a threat or a damage done to the integrity of the social order that defines criminality. That it's not about making whole or making good or making right the person that you've done wrong, but rather the danger of undermining this integrity that is really at stake. And this does in fact seem to be a novel thing. This doesn't seem to actually have something correspondent prior to the 1500s or whatever. This is a new way of articulating what it is that's quote wrong.
Yeah, no, I like your point too about Will about the grand narratives. And he doesn't, because he makes this point about the emergence of the criminal as a social enemy and not just as somebody who has wronged somebody and has to make reparations for that wrong. So that he does that analysis, and then later he kind of shifts the analysis and says, well, there's also this category of illegalisms. And I know we didn't get too much into that in what we read for today, but this concept of illegalisms, which he also introduces at the end of Discipline and Punish, is basically, he contrasts it with actual just infractions of the law, and says that in the modern punitive system, there are plenty of things that might be illegal or legal on the books, but they're not actually meant to be enforced all the time, right? They're not actually meant to be, and also the class character of the infraction matters too. And so
there are these moments that he analyzes where he's when do, for instance, the nascent bourgeoisie get involved and demand that the law is enforced. Part of what's interesting is that he's pointing out in the punitive society lectures that seemingly everybody is aware that the universality of the law is bullshit, right? Everyone knows, both the legislators and the people who are subject to the law are aware that the law isn't actually by and for everyone, right? That the law is
it's made by people that it's not meant to apply to, right?
Correct.
And it's applied to people that didn't write it, and it's,
Yeah, exactly. And there seems to be a kind of recognition of this point. One of the interesting questions, I guess, that I have coming out of this is it's fascinating that there seemingly was this awareness of that truth, which in our sort of moment is not a matter of widespread consciousness or recognition. A lot of people, I think, if you were to ask them, would say that, of course, the laws apply to everyone indifferently and equally.
Yeah, but we all know that white collar people in towers are allowed to do as much blow as they want, right? And
right.
And in certain places, nobody cares if you're drinking outside, but if you're in an area that's gentrifying, the law is now applied differentially.
Yeah, yeah, but I think that most people, even when they recognize that as an exception and not the rule, right? which seems to be the thing that he's pointing out here.
Yeah, what I take, and I understand, like, sometimes, Foucault will say things, I'm not just trying to give you a method that you're supposed to, walk around with, that, he wants to have some specificity, but, this is a specific way of trying to ask questions about, even though it seems like he's just talking about history, it's always quite clear when you're reading Foucault, he wants to be commenting on his present society. He wants to give us some sort of vantage point that shakes off the preconceptions that we have, that allows us to return to these questions from a new vantage point. And by focusing on issues of criminality or civil war, he's asking us to look again at what does it mean for an order to stabilize itself. I like at the end of one of those lectures, he asks how does a society produce its enemies? How does it reach this point of decomposition that it has so many internal enemies that it has to deal with? And I wonder if in our current context, we're thinking a lot about crime. The numbers are sometimes hard to parse. It seems like maybe murders are going up in the United States, but other crimes are going down. It's hard to know actually who to trust on these, on these statistics. But you want to be able to ask, well, so what can explain what is happening here? Why these crimes are being committed, and what is criminality supposed to be doing for a broader society, rather than naturalizing it as it's clearly about some sort of restitution that the individual gives, but we're asking broader questions of what is the state or the public's investments in this category of crime. And so I think he's trying to shift our sort of present conceptions of what our social order is and give us another way in to analyzing these conjunctures.
So, like, why is it this way, though? I mean, like, there's this way in which, like, at the beginning of the conversation, Owen was like, this is the Foucault in which you get to see the stakes of his analysis. And it seems like what you guys are saying is, like, the stakes of the analysis are to, like, denaturalize things, to give us a new perspective, to see how, in the usual, like, Foucauldian fashion, power is produced. It's not just, repressive. So people, like, the criminal is made, and social movements kind of shape the conditions in which, they have to then be controlled. It's just not like raw repression all the time. The kind of repression is actually a produced kind of repression. But, like, I actually don't quite always understand, like, that's like a meta point that, like, runs throughout all of Foucault's work. And, like, I think that that's probably the thing you can't take away from Foucault. Like, you have to kind of give him his flowers, like the argument against the repressive hypothesis, whether it's like through sexuality or through the status of the criminal or whatever. That's the thing I'm always sympathetic to. But what I don't actually understand is, like, the angle that he's making us look at this through. Like, I don't know why it has to be that way. Like, why civil war? And, like, why his obsession with the state? And, like, why, like, not any other number of explanations that don't have to be teleological?
His obsession with the state.
Well, like, so when you say, like the state kind of produces the criminal, and he's, like, interested in the particular kind of transition of sovereign power, like, it's interesting, but I don't actually always understand, like, there is another way into these problems, I'm sure, like, and I think that what I don't always understand is about Foucault, and what I mean by, like, not always understanding the stakes, is that he is so historical in the way that he, like, reads these developments. But, like, historians are kind of notorious for being, like, overly descriptive, obsessed with events, and not always offering explanations. And so I feel like when we read Foucault, we're seeing these developments, and we're seeing the developments of these forms of power and these discourses. And, like, I'm never quite sure we're actually talking about an explanation. It seems to me like we're putting together a story or a pattern. And it's interesting. Like, I think there are some things he gets right. I'm not, like, fully anti-Foucault. I just, like, it seems like we always talk about this like he's explaining something. And I just assume that, like, social scientists have other ways of explaining these things, no?
What I'd want to say here is that I want to, like, agree with both of you and say that, like, why I think Owen's right to say that this weird moment in the early 70s is when the stakes are clearest is precisely because, like, if you even in Discipline and Punish, it's not clear why this is happening. Like, it is this, like, catalog of descriptions that doesn't have a coherent sort of narrative or historical sort of, weirdly, it's kind of absent historical contextualization, right? Like, you get these, like, I always think there's this really funny line in, like, I think the second version of the introduction to Ian Hacking's book, The Emergence of Probability, where he's like, yeah, I was kind of doing the Foucault thing, where you're like, look at how they talked about this now. And then, oh, look, 80 years later, look at how they talk about the same thing. It looks so different. It's crazy. And it's like, whoa, everything's different. Like, we're using different terms and concepts. There's a different mode of schematization. And like a lot of Foucault is like this, where I think you're right, Lillian. Like, there's not an explanation, actually. It's just like there once was this way and now there is this way of talking. Or of making sense of things. But here in the early 70s, he's like, actually, it's about class, which is not something that he usually does, I don't think.
Yeah, it shows like criminality at various points in history has been sometimes useful, right, for class antagonisms. There have been moments where like the nobility found a certain kind of criminality useful, and later it becomes no longer beneficial to coordinate with that kind of criminality. And so then the whole juridical framework has to shift in order to single out, isolate, and attack this form of criminality, which was previously acceptable. But I think so. I don't think you're wrong. But I do think that a lot of what he's doing is like attacking a certain model of explanation, which is the kind of discourse of political philosophy, which says that the way, which gives a kind of genetic account of institutions, practices, and norms from a history of like enlightenment and from a kind of history of basically an idealist history of the development of like concepts of right. And he says like if you want to actually see like where the systems of power that we live under, where they come from, you don't look to a genetic account of a political philosophical genetic account that says that at a certain point private property became a good idea, and then that seemed like it was a more right and just idea. So he says look at the kinds of antagonisms, right, that were driving history at that moment, and class antagonism is one of those. And it seems in these lectures like it's the most important antagonism for him in terms of what drives the history of systems of at least punitive power. But to look at those antagonisms as the motive of that history rather than looking at the kind of idealist concepts that were produced by those historical moments.
Yeah, so it seems like what Foucault is doing is he's challenging a model of history that really does seem to sometimes take it as like some famous person you've heard of came up with this great idea, and we were like, you know what, we have rationally assessed that is a good idea. Instead, he wants you to look at, you have to go to like the marginalia of history to see the sort of bloody struggles and fights that were happening for these concepts to be produced. Yeah. What I'm not always getting from Foucault, and maybe Foucault will jump all over me over this, is so I can sometimes see the explanation. I can sometimes see why it's interesting to look at it this way. What is the prescription we're supposed to take from all of this, though? Because I don't think it says anything as facile as, so now that we know the sort of bloody history and the class antagonism behind the concept of criminality, we're supposed to abolish criminality. Foucault never says anything as easy as all of that. He doesn't give us a moral. Yet it cannot be that he's just like it cannot be like what you were describing with Ian Hacking. Like, it's just like, isn't this really interesting? How these things shifted?
I do kind of sense sometimes most of the time when I read Foucault, just that there is some kind of deep substrate of nihilism that runs through the work. I mean, it's not like I don't think you have to expect of him that to reevaluate values or whatever, or to give us a full kind of normative account of what follows.
Meet the Nietzschean challenge, man. Go hard.
I know,
Can't do
right?
it.
Own it. If you're going to crib from Nietzsche, do it.
You don't
Man
even
is
have
something
to
that must go down.
you don't even have to do the bourgeois like norms thing. Like, just give us a revaluation of values or something, but you don't even get that.
I think you're right that like that's not something that's like there in Foucault. But by the way, like Foucauldians are so guilty of this, like this facile prescriptivism about like how to like try to not be a governed, desirous, like neoliberal subject.
I do feel like I think you're right, Gil. Like, so aside from these texts, like when Owen is saying like there is this kind of like deeper way in which like Foucault is like pretty self-aware that like about the limits of his own analysis. Like I do appreciate that about him. Like I don't always get the feeling. I mean, the things he says about Marxism in general usually just piss me off. But when I put brackets around that, because like he's very responsible for like the Marxism and liberalism are actually the same. And that's pretty much what we do now in philosophy. So
well, I think there's no question he's responsible for a lot of bad things.
Right. So there's this way in which like that despite whatever disagreements I might have in the way he frames things, like I do think that you can't read this much and kind of be this thorough and pedantic if you're not actually aware of the limitations of your own framework. When you go really hard, sorry, I've been watching a lot about basketball. That's why I have all the go in the paint metaphors and
Hell
shit.
yeah.
But like when you go
All
really
right,
hard,
Bulls.
yes.
Hell yes.
5-1, baby. So like we
DeRozan
have
just crushing it.
yes. So anyway, like when you go really hard like that, you can't possibly be unaware of like exactly what you're trying to prove and probably what you're not. You know, like you don't like follow through like that if you think you're trying to exhaust the terrain of like social and political analysis or explanation. So like I kind of respect Foucault's boundaries. I don't respect Foucauldian's boundaries, man. Like they like there's this way in which I genuinely get the impression that it's just like biopower and it's just bowling us over, and we're just reproducing it and we don't know why.
And anything you try to do to oppose it actually ends up just,
Captured
like you
in
said,
advance.
reproducing. You're captured in advance and
Right,
you're reproducing
yeah.
it.
Where, he says stuff like that here, where it's like, you effectuate, you activate, you reactivate, you create the myth of power. And there's like a fundamental way in which that's true. Like that is kind of like how social movements and power structures of power evolve. But then like, and maybe this is just like being uncharitable, but the reason I don't return to Foucault as like a useful resource for myself is pretty much because I feel like whatever is, like it's almost not worth digging beneath this like other stratum of the way Foucault is interpreted. That's kind of like a big picture problem I have, but I do think that that's like my honest judgment. It's not that like I think Foucault isn't useful. It's that I'm just like not going to do battle with the stuff I find that's not useful to like get there. Like I'm never going to pursue that in my work.
Yeah, I just thought the point about the minutia and the marginalia I think is really interesting, because one of the things I do like about Foucault and that I do go back to him for is some of his reconstructions of a certain historically specific discourse. There's not a lot of philosophers, right, political philosophers, that will be like, okay, we need to actually spend some time getting into what the levelers around the time of the English Civil Wars, like, and the levelers and diggers, as he talks about in Society Must Be Defended, what were they saying? Not just like some of the statements they made, but what's the actual coherent thought inside of like the levelers and diggers like movement? And now he doesn't always like stick the landing, because I feel like even with that specific analysis, he's importing a lot of what he wants them to be saying. Like, look, they're not actually doing like class warfare here. They're doing like race war against the Normans, the Norman yoke, right? And so
Sometimes you gotta invent your own ancestors, man.
But I kind of feel like that's gonna go awry a lot of the time. When you're trying to talk for 30 pages or for 2 hours about what like some weaver said in like 17th century Brittany or something, right? And like why that's more important for the genesis of the state than what Hobbes said. Right. And so it's fucking audacious, and like sometimes it like almost kind of works and it blows me away. But yeah, I'm generally apprehensive about it, but I do think that I still think it is a rich resource, and I do still like go back to it for that.
Well, so like on the one hand, I wanted to return to something that you said before. You wonder about a concept like criminality, right? And he's giving such a different kind of account than you do get in, as you said, like the sort of general, more or less still to this day, majoritarian accounts in political philosophy. And because of their weird idealism, right? Like, if you read stuff like this today, it still sounds like this bananas nonsense that you get with like Kant and Hegel, where it's like, why do we punish the criminal? Well, they have done wrong to the concept of right itself. And the concept of right demands that they be punished. And it's like, what the fuck are you people talking about?
The idea demands their punishment.
The idea demands their punishment. And instead, he's like, no, wait, what are the actual sort of like contextually specific and historically sensitive conditions under which some people's sort of infractions are treated as serious and others not? And this does have to do with like an account of power, and it is deeply tied up with things like class and the nascent concepts of race. Like you said, he doesn't always stick the landing, I don't think. But the other thing that I wanted to say, too, is that like I, like you, Lillian, am usually just infuriated by his statements about Marxism as such. I think the context is somewhat helpful here, though. The PCF in France in the 60s and 70s was like straight up Stalinist. And this is the Marxism that he has in mind when he makes these denunciations, which is, I think we can say it, an idealist, teleological, and frankly, unhelpful way of thinking about history, about theory and practice. That he's like, look at these people. These are the major representatives. And even like the Althusser's school, like our very first episode of the show was about Althusser, with whom I'm maybe more sympathetic than I should be. But there's obviously idealistic elements there, right? And this is what he's responding to and saying, no. Can we, instead of like constructing these weird grand narratives, like actually look at what people are doing and saying at these various conjunctures at the moment when something like the state is coalescing and becoming something that has some actual power? That makes sense to me. Latter-day Foucauldians should not just adopt wholesale this rejection of, quote, Marxism, because the context is different.
And despite Foucault's own statements, like, he didn't do that. Like, you can see the impact of Marxism, especially, I mean, it's probably why I like this period of his work the best. Like, you can see the impact of Marxism on the work that he does in the 70s. It's clearly there, despite his own really stubborn, really annoying, like, just constant dismissals of Marxism. There's a funny line from Balibar that's, I guess Balibar did a response to the 71 lectures where he says, yeah, it's amazing how, like, Foucault, like, attributes to Althusser all the things that Althusser said he was replacing about Marxism. Like, he attributes all the things that Althusser said, like, okay, these are the things that we need to replace, and Balibar says did replace. He's like, no, that's just what Althusser is actually about. Like,
that's a big L right there.
Yeah, it's a huge L.
So this is something that I'm having a hard time squaring, though. I want to be generous about what I think is really helpful in what Foucault is doing, but we keep coming back to our kind of distaste of Foucault's disavowal of Marxism, and I want to ask the question about what is supposed to be the pragmatics of this. So Foucault is able to get this very specific viewpoint on how criminality emerged and how the state emerged, because he is in a sense it actually helps. He is so far removed from that historical context that he's able to go into these forgotten documents and start to rebuild this discourse. But just because we are looking at how something like criminality formed back in the 16th or the 15th century, why should I believe that one tells me anything about the contemporary context? And two, it seems to me, how would one do a Foucauldian analysis of one's present context when it seems so much of what Foucault is doing is the historical distance makes it possible. And so what one might find really helpful in Marxism is that Marxism is trying to, certain versions of Marxist analysis are trying to give you general principles that even in different conjunctures will give you the grounding or the handhold to be able to analyze a new situation. Obviously lazy Marxism is just like looking back at what people were doing in like the 1600s and be like, nothing's changed. Like, it's just that. It's just class warfare, baby. And I'm like, okay, I guess. I don't know. Feel like, things are a little bit different now. And so I'm trying to understand, like, when I'm reading this Foucault stuff, I know he wants us to be commenting on society, but why in the world should I be convinced that something that happened 500 years ago bears on not generating productive knowledge for us to understand what's happening now?
Especially if knowledge is as productive as he says. Like, and so that's why I think a lot of like the more contemporary stuff seems so like, I don't know, tendentiously related to like other historical and political developments, because like if your primary method is like, if I just like look at discourses and I see how they diverge and come back together and morph, like there is a way in which like there has to be a structure for thinking about that. Like you can't just like pick random stuff and be like, this is it, this is the point of entry. Like I think that's what I was trying to say. And I think that to Foucault's credit, I don't think it's like random what he's doing, like those sources he's drawing on or whatever. But there's nothing clarifying about what you should think of. Yeah, like what is it? And I think that the problem, and I'm just kind of stuck on this. I fought myself, my postmodern self fought its way out, left my body after years and years. But like, I just don't think that the analysis is helpful. Like, okay, you're talking about discourse. Sweet. Like, if that's all there is and you can't say anything about ideology or, because let me back up. Like, what I think is really great about Foucault is that if you actually had some idea of truth, like falsifiable and scientific and not absolute and like wacky, then you could think of yourself as doing an idea, like thinking about how ideologies really form, you know, and that's super empowering in a certain way, because you can say, listen, they are dispersed. They're actually really contradictory. They're not coherent, which means you can shift them and you can think about why they would form in one place and not another based on other factors. And that seems dope, but like he doesn't want to think like that. Like he doesn't think that there's like a reason that this is all happening. And that's why I think he has this misleading like way of saying, just like showing you a pattern, because he thinks that in itself is demonstrating something. And I don't know. I just think like if I'm into truth, you know, I think you're trying to explain stuff. There's better and worse explanations. There are better and more or less accurate ways of thinking about your circumstances. Partial, you know, I can be a good continentalist in that way. But anyway, that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I mean, with Foucault and reason, if we wanted to be generous to him, I think, you know, the best he could say is, I can give you local reasons why in this specific, you know, context, it seems like this thing might be happening. But then where it kind of falters is you feel like I'm supposed to get some sort of general principle from this, right? But, you know, the Foucault that we get, especially the Foucault who kind of like, you know, crosses swords with Sartre, is that, you know, Foucault isn't trying to be what he calls, and this is a pejorative for Foucault, I think, something the general or the universal intellectual, that what we need is a specific intellectual who takes stands on limited, very narrow issues and, you know, just tries to dig into them. For all of like someone like Sartre's problems, is that Sartre thought, I can help you grasp a general principle of what's going on, something trans-contextual. And what I always get struggle with, and maybe it's not with Foucault, but maybe it's with Foucauldians per se, is that Foucault does all these specific analyses, but I never get him saying, so here's a trans-contextual principle that will allow you to understand how I'm selecting these documents, why these are the ones that help us understand this specific formation. But sometimes it feels as if, and I don't mean to be dunking on Foucauldians, some of my best friends are Foucauldians. I live next door to a Foucauldian.
That's no excuse.
It's like they read that and then they're like, so Foucault gave us a general history and so we just need to do what he did. But it seems like he places limitations on his procedure or method that doesn't allow you to do that. So the best you can say is, in these local situations, here are these patterns that emerge, and here are the possible explanations we can give for what's happening. But I don't know what justifies looking at that and saying, and thus it follows in this other context.
But I know you want to come back, Owen. Let me just like real quick add to this that like this is precisely why I do that dunk on like the late Foucault, where it's like, let's look at gymnastics diaries from Roman antiquity, because it's like, okay, he clearly thinks that this is illuminating for the present for some fucking reason, and I don't know why it is, and it's not clear why we should be reading that or thinking about that and not something else, right? And like,
it just doesn't vibe with me.
Well, it's not clear why the discourse around Roman gymnastics is like a subjugated knowledge. That's what he says he wants to do in genealogy, right? Like, he says that in society must be defended, right? That genealogy does it's an insurrection in knowledge, he calls it, right? We're gonna do it. We're gonna like liberate subjugated discourses, right?
These
and
people
like
are doing
a bunch of fucking Romans, like doing various different gymnastics,
running marathons, if you will.
Yeah.
Well, it's because Italians are black, and he's trying to do what he can for the black radical tradition.
That's true. I forgot.
Foucault is a good Rawlsian in this regard.
Yeah. But I wanted to come back to one thing, though, about the point about truth and some of what you were saying, Will, and like just ask a kind of like stupid outside of the internal stakes of Foucauldian discourse, and just say like, isn't it like true what he says about the birth of the prison, though? It isn't, like, in a pretty straightforward sense, right? Like, he does the historical work. He shows that this was never actually about reform. It wasn't actually about correcting. They're not correctional facilities. Like, they're not actually about correcting or improving people, right? They're actually about shaping, subjugating, as he uses this language of like subjectivating, right? Creating a certain kind of docile subject. And that if you want to understand the kind of mechanisms by which we've become so governable, and I think that's a question worth asking, like, how the fuck have we become so governable? Because we are one governable fucking populace. he has some answers.
Not me, baby. You
He
can't
has some,
govern me.
yeah, exactly. he has some
free.
answers.
I'm
right?
built
I'm
different.
outside.
Yeah, nobody can govern y'all. No, but he has some answers, and so, maybe there's the meme about how the prison is everywhere, and that's one of his answers is like, well, there's this penitentiary model of like, individuation and being rendered docile by institutions or whatever. But I think that, like, again, in a kind of stupid way, I mean, his account of the genesis of the prison and the penitentiary form of subjectivation and surveillance. I mean, that seems to me just like definitely true compared to the other really stupid story, which is that people wanted to help these poor criminals like get better and join society and be happy. I mean, do you see what I'm saying?
I think I'm completely on Lillian's team here, though. Like, I think it is descriptively true what he says, and it's not an explanation. Like, I still don't like.
It doesn't have causal.
It doesn't have any causal sort of account, and I think it is to your point.
But it
is more descriptively accurate than the alternative. Let's call them ideological accounts of why it is that we imprison people, and it still feels untethered from an actual causal story that would actually be inscribed within a historical sequence.
Okay, but the reason why I wanted to read these lectures is because I think there is an attempt at a causal explanation in these lectures in a way that I don't see anywhere else in his work, right? He tries to say, this is the history of the bourgeoisie, this is their system of punishment and penitentiary, and this is the function that it serves, right?
Yeah,
it has it's very economically important. Like, he gets into, in the 19th century, this is later in the lectures, I get into the 19th century when basically industrialization happens and there are massive concentrations of like products in one place and all these workers, it's not like people coming in to steal stuff. It's like now workers are really close to all of this really valuable stuff and they're actually in charge of like taking care of it. And so like, he's like, well, now the whole system of punishment, a whole new set of laws, a whole new way of administering justice has to be devised in order to protect massive stocks of capital from worker depredation. Right. Yeah. And so like that is to me, like, is that right or wrong? I don't know. I'm saying that is at least like close to as close to a genetic account or a causal account as I think you're going to get in Foucault. And so,
Agreed.
Okay, so if it's as close to a causal account, then I just have to ask back to Gil's earlier point, like, why is that not just a very Althusserian way of doing things? And like, I mean, it just seems to me like that's kind of the argument you would make if you like thought there were ideological state apparatuses that basically served the function of stabilizing the society for class interests, no?
Well, what he says in those 71 lectures is that he actually is disagreeing with Althusser and saying, well, not necessarily disagreeing, but just saying, look, like, I'm not going to focus on the ideological apparatuses stuff. Right? This is before his whole turn against the repressive hypothesis. And he actually is like, listen, the whole repressive apparatus, like you guys all just take that for granted, right? You think the interesting one is the ideological apparatus. Like that's what we really need to understand. And everybody just thinks, oh, the repressive apparatus, right. Obviously the cops will dispatch your face. And if you do something that's not in like the ruling class's interest, and he's like, no. Like, let's step back and actually like look at this repressive apparatus, how it functions, who it's meant to benefit and serve, and who it targets. And the way it targets them, right?
Nice.
I mean, so much better to me than like later just being like, the repressive hypothesis is stupid. Power is only productive. But
yeah. So I agree with that. That makes sense. And I've also thought, like, in reading Discipline and Punish and these like early 70s lectures, like it feels like what he's trying to do is give an account of the reproduction, not of the relations of production. Right, which is, I think, what the analysis of ideology is meant to do in Althusserian sort of milieus, but the mechanisms of the reproduction of labor power, right, the forces of production. Like that's what like the analysis of this microphysics of power is about, like, you know, how these bodies are produced and reproduced that are going to be productive, maximally productive, and so on. Like that all tracks. This I like and I can get down with. But I want to come back to something that Will said before, because I think there's still like a weird method problem in Foucault that I've never been able to figure out, which is, as you said, Will, it seems as though we have the ability in like a Foucauldian key to analyze discourses and structures of power only because they belong to the past, right? And so like there's a sort of weird, like, we can't talk about the present because we're still enmeshed within contemporary forms of power. We're too inside of its discursive sort of
Ala Minerva, etc.
Yeah. So like if we can only talk about, you know, what was going on in the birth of the prison in the 1600s or whatever, because it's 300 years ago. How then is this meant to shed light on the present if I can't talk about the present in the same way because I'm within these discourses, right? It seems like either I can't speak about the present or I can, but this seems like something that he methodologically sees as illegitimate. Does this make sense?
I kind of want to jump in because this is also what I was thinking. Because sometimes, my issue is, it sometimes seems like we're helping Foucault out because he is not, at least from what I can tell from everything he's saying, he's not just trying to give you a linear history. This isn't him just saying, we went from A to B to C. I could understand if he's doing, and I would call that, to use the kind of language, something vertical. Like, he's trying to say transcontextually, I'm showing you how this is happening, and this is the principle that's still operative. But if he's doing something horizontal, then, it makes sense that he's talking about a bounded context and saying, you've misunderstood this historical moment. And I'm going to shatter your perception of what was going on there. And that sometimes it feels very much like A, shatter your historical conception of what's going on there. B, question mark. C, new subjectivity. And I'm like, what's the B? Because if it's not as simple as him saying, this is how the prison formed, and so I'm giving you another linear history, another linear history that you didn't realize, then we do have to explain how we make the contextual jump. Like, look, you're not going to hear me say, actually, it turns out, 300 years later, prisons really are about correction, and it's all about emancipating the individual. You won't hear me saying that. But, there's sort of a meta argument that needs to be made of how do we go from the horizontal contextualism to, not just giving another linear history, if that's what, on Foucault's own terms, not what he's trying to do. If that is what he's trying to do, then it's unclear how he's different from other historians.
Yeah, I wish I could remember what else he said. He has this interview where he says that what his work is about doing a history of the present.
Right.
He says it's about understanding the present.
Right.
But I completely agree that I don't see what the principle of connection is between the present and the various discrete historical instances that he examines.
Yeah, because sometimes, and I don't want to be too hard on the guy and all that, but sometimes it can feel like it's very impressionistic. Thing is, I can get on board when Foucault starts giving rich descriptions of how space is partitioned and how bodies are moving. It's really hard not to look at that and say there's something very true there.
Totally,
I am getting insight into how relations are reproduced, given a very materialist account that it turns out the way buildings are structured isn't just a lark. But it's about how do we constrain certain habits and expectations and produce a certain type of either docility or governability. But on the other hand, I don't think we want to say that these principles that we see in their formation 300 years from our present just remain stable. And it's just carrying forward.
They can't have.
And that's why sometimes it's helpful to have the meta framework that would be able to explain why certain changes emerged. But that seems to be the very thing that Foucault wants to withdraw from us, right?
Maybe the issue is use the word a materialist account. Talked about materialism. Maybe we should actually just ask is Foucault a materialist? And if he is, what kind of materialist is he? Because he's not a historical materialist in the Marxist sense. And yet, his intervention in especially the discourses of political philosophy, people that talk about sovereignty and right, is that they basically have an idealist account that is totally unmoored from the kinds of institutions, the actual history and institutions and practices.
Yeah, on the ground practices.
And antagonisms, including class antagonisms that gave rise to those concepts, which is I think a thoroughly materialist move. But I don't know, I'm just curious if you guys have any thoughts on what that can be called a materialist, and what kind of materialist? I know the discourse stuff from the 60s is definitely not materialist, right? That is that episteme stuff, right? The archaeology, the historical a priori archaeological stuff. I don't think it'd be fair to call it materialist, but
I mean,
I'm hard pressed. I don't know.
Does it really matter? Does it matter to answering that question? I don't know.
Well, in as much as we, I think all agree that a materialist approach is a prerequisite for having a non-mystified understanding of the present and of the historical conditions that made it possible. And also, therefore, what we would need to do about things. then I think it is an important question, and I'm hard pressed to say that I think that Foucault is a materialist. I don't know. I do wonder for a couple of different reasons. I think you're right that his challenge is always that prevailing historical and theoretical accounts are idealist. But then when I read what it is that he's doing, I'm like, I'm not sure if this actually, at the end of the day, is materialist in a meaningful way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Could it be both of those?
I think so. Actually, that makes sense because he's interested in not like the philosophical discourse that you find in great philosophy tomes, but he's still interested in discourses. Ultimately, it's like discourses happening by people who run prisons, or like discourses happening by superintendents at a school or something, right? Like it is still discourses ultimately.
Even like the new Pied, right? He's like in these 71, 72 lectures, he's like, look at how they talk about who their leader is, and they made up a leader, and they have a mythical figure of the leader. He's still interested primarily in how people talk about themselves, and it's just not clear that that's good enough. I mean, like to go back to what Will was saying before, like this is part of why I think we all identify as Marxists. It's because Marxism allows us not to talk just about how people talk about themselves, but the laws of motion of capital, tendencies that are imminent to the social structure about accumulation, these dynamisms that like have a logic that we can identify, which doesn't have anything to do with how people talk about who they think they are or whatever, right? It's there's something there. There's a real there, that like I sometimes worry there isn't.
But maybe he would say though that like the Marxists don't talk about the kind of what he calls the capillary points in like systems of power, right? The points that are at the far edges, the marginal, liminal points that they don't seem like they have a kind of agency in the way our society is structured, and yet nothing could be more important than looking at what happens in this neglected part of our society, or this neglected practice or something. I don't know.
I mean, if that's like
I'm trying my best here
to give.
Then
like
you're doing a great job.
I would just be like, dude, like if that's how you feel, then why don't you go look over there and do it in a materialist way? Like, why do you have to do it in the way that you do?
But I think some of his followers.
Like, there's this logic to the way Foucault is interpreted, where it's like he's the one who's going to check out the margins, because the liberals and the Marxists, they don't care about the margins. We care about the margins, and that seems very morally important to do, as you say. But then it's like, why do you have to look at the margins like that? And I think that it's pretty idealist. I think that there's moments in which I'm quite sympathetic, and having said, for people listening, I did give Foucault his flowers several times in this episode. I feel like what he ultimately thinks constrains people is the episteme. And like, that's why once we're in it, we can't really understand it until we change the episteme. Like, we're so opaque to ourselves that we're not able to shift our own episteme. And I think, again, having some idea of like, we actually can have some kind of adequate enough knowledge of the world to understand it enough to try to do something about it now. And that people also understood their own social structures in their own time. And that's part of how we can meaningfully talk about political agency. To me, that's what a materialist would do. Whether you're a Marxist or not, you could do it in some other way. I just think that like he really thinks that our ideas are trapping us.
Yeah, I want to build on that real quick, because this has like been percolating in my head. It sometimes seems to me that one of the I will say one of the worst legacies of Foucauldianism is this almost sort of paranoid subjectivity, where we never know what it is that we're actually doing. Nice. You think how many times have people told me, as Foucault says, knowledge is power, knowledge is for cutting, and so you think you're talking about Look at what happened with Agamben during COVID. Like, that is like, that's like Foucault brain on steroids. Everything
Do I want to know
see.
What happened with Agamben?
He wrote a bunch of bad poetry.
Well, he did that, but everything is like, you all don't realize that this is biopower, and this is the new form, and it becomes a sort of anything that you say that you're doing, you don't really know that you might be doing something else. And so what Lily was talking about, this sort of fundamental opaqueness to ourselves, I think that is built into Foucault, and sometimes people look at it as a source of freedom. I don't want to know who I am. Doesn't Foucault says that later in his writings, and so it's how does this constrain Foucauldianism from becoming something like, you start seeing in a really sort of mematic way, I see power everywhere. That's why there is the meme of schools are prisons, prisons are prisons, the cafeteria is a prison. And so it has this type of structure of you never know what it is that you're doing. And once you've like blown out that structure, other ways of thinking like social theory, they don't start from the principle that in principle you can never really know what it is that you're doing. Yeah. That it is possible to grasp what is going on, who we are, and what we are doing. And there's like a type of legacy of Foucauldianism that really leans hard on this opaqueness, that all these things that you think that you're doing, all these principles that you have are really controverted, and you won't realize it until afterwards.
I do want to say that like this isn't like unique. There's something about this that isn't just like unique to Foucault or to Foucauldians, though. Like a lot of critical social theory departs from the supposition that the way things naturally or spontaneously appear is not adequate, and like it requires some kind of analysis in order to make sense of what we sort of spontaneously think. I mean,
Marxists do it too, right?
Marxists
You're just doing
do this all the
bourgeois.
time.
Your movement turns out to be bourgeois. It's actually not. Like you thought it was radical. It's
Who's captured within ideology, right? Like this happens in other, what we would identify as materialist, radical, and critical traditions as well. I think that the thing that like galls me based on what you were just saying, Will, is that like there seems to be this like further claim, not just that like how we tend to think sort of spontaneously is wrong, but that like there can't be like an actual adequate understanding of the present. Like there's something impossible in principle, right? Like a hard block where like we won't be able to say, here it is. It's October 31st, 2021. And none of us can say today, but in 20 years looking back, people will be able to say, oh, well, yeah, look at the episteme that they were in and what they actually thought or whatever. And like, there's something about like the in principle, impossible to get past opacity of the present that I find frustrating methodologically. And
based on
maybe
what you and Will are saying, I feel like maybe Foucault just has like an utterly corrosive effect on like emancipatory struggle. Like, that's not where I intended to end up.
That's our out of context drop. That's the drop for the episode.
Because you need like movements need a kind of like epistemological self-confidence, like a sense of like of having understood something, and like a sense of having some autonomy over the direction that they want things to go. And Foucault is just so utterly corrosive to all of those different ways of relating to oneself, both as an individual and as a group. Okay, I set out to defend some of Foucault, but I'm done.
I think that's like a really important point, because I mean, I don't know what this means to me, actually. It's just a passing thought that I'm reading this book about. It's called Lenin Rediscovered, and it's basically an analysis of what is to be done that's like 550 pages long. And the first, I've only gotten this.
That's too many pages, by the way.
Much too long, indeed.
That's too long.
But half of the first chapter is talking about how Karl Kautsky influences Lenin. And he's trying to overthrow this interpretation of Lenin, that is Lenin thinking that he needs to bring the wisdom of socialism to the workers from the outside of the workers' struggle, because he doesn't really think the workers can do it by themselves. And the book is, the reason it's this long is there's this received interpretation that is what Lenin said, and this guy who wrote it, Lars Lee, is like, that is not what Lenin said. Lenin was extremely optimistic about the worker struggle. He was responding to Karl Kautsky's way of saying, like, bringing the good news, the good tidings of historical agency to the working class, just being like very... And I was reading some of these passages in which Karl Kautsky was saying stuff like this, and it is very much like proselytizing. We can do it, people, and literally like spreading the good tidings of socialism. And I was thinking that, you do have to have a kind of teleological idea of like the inevitability of this. Okay, fine, But on the other hand, it seems to like really inspire people. And so did Ferdinand Lassalle. This is what he was doing. They were like, workers really thought that they could control their destiny, and in almost a quasi-religious way. And I think that we think so much about the limitations about this way of thinking that I'm just struck by but don't we need a little faith, that we can go somewhere good, that we can build a society that we're going for. And I just don't think that I get the problem there, but it just seems like the thing that makes Foucault very neoliberal is that he fundamentally discourages us from having any
Utterly
such
faithless.
ideas.
Absolutely faithless.
Any such ideas. And that is the neoliberal period, like the idea that there is no alternative and we cannot see beyond what we are doing right now, both epistemically and in general, is like, that is kind of, with all due respect, his legacy on kind of how people think about politics as a big picture. And so if there's like truth to that accusation that he is neoliberal, despite I think his own efforts to the contrary, you know, I just think that that is what has been inherited, whether he meant it or not. And like, maybe you could take a lesson from some of the crudeness of like bringing good tidings from people from the beginning of the 20th century. Like maybe that isn't so, you know, maybe that's not like holistically bad.
Well, for a guy who
block
like, Foucault,
intensifies. Yes, the episode is coming, folks.
This was like similar to a point that I wanted to make in the Kant episode about Kant's defense of teleology. Right? He just says like, at the end of the day, like this is an idea, the idea that things will kind of at least not work against us. Maybe like not necessarily work in our favor, but the idea that at least the universe isn't stacked against what this good thing that we want to do, build a kingdom of ends or whatever. Like you can't act unless you have, it's like a structural element of like the human psychology of action.
Yeah.
That like you have to believe to some extent that it's possible.
But the thing that's missing, right? And the reason that he has to be faithless here and why there's not this teleology is because there's no positive idea. There's only negative prescriptions with Foucault, right? Like you get an analysis, for instance, of disciplinary power or of, you know, punitive power, punitive theories, state power, biopolitics. And these all just feel bad. It feels like I don't like those things. I don't like it. Disciplinary power is enacted on me. I don't like sovereign power, blah, blah, blah. I don't have an idea about what I would want instead. I just know that I don't like this. It's just negative. It's a negative, merely negative prescription at all times, right? So there's no question of spreading the good news of what. All I know is I'd like to not be governed the way that I am right now, which again is this sort of like nihilistic, anarchistic, let's say, like in a pejorative sense. I know we've got our good, you know, Gustav Landauer he's our good, like positive, mystical anarchist. But this is like a negative anarchism where like, you know, power as such seems like a problem. And actually, this was what was one of the cool things about these 71 lectures is that like when he says like, look, civil war involves people taking and using power, he seems kind of jazzed about it, right? He doesn't seem like this is a bad thing. He's like, actually, this is cool. Check it out.
He's thinking about that revolt, like the one revolt, the one instance of rebellion or revolt that he actually pays some attention to, I think in the whole of his work.
Yeah, but it's weird. Even there, like he's not making claims about like, you know, why it was cool that they wanted to try to build a certain different kind of society.
Yeah.
He's still just like,
it's just like, this is what they were saying.
This is what they were saying. They didn't like getting taxed, so they used some power, and it's kind of sick. And it's like, all right, man, yeah, nice, I guess, cool. Insurrection's cool, but it's just negative. It's only ever negative prescriptions.
I guess the one thing that was hopeful for positive was the Iranian Revolution.
That's true.
Maybe it's an object for a whole other episode, but he was super psyched about the Iranian Revolution in '79.
But I don't know. Here's a positive vision: communal democratic ownership of the means of production. You know. I feel like that's a cool,
it's pithy.
It's a positive.
Yeah, I mean, I think the last thing I want to say on all this, and it's like this actually feels like the thing that I can like never forgive Foucault for, is his participation in the withering away of being able to actually state sort of a grand comprehensive vision of what freedom could look like. The amount of conversations I've had with Foucauldians where I've been like, I think this is what it would look like for us to be more free, and all of that is it's almost as if I'm duped. Like you can't possibly say that.
That just sounds like another prison.
Possibly know that
another prison,
and that that we have to focus on these sort of micro struggles. And when I want to push, like, so what is the systemic notion of freedom that we're talking about? It's as if that faculty, that habit, that character, whatever you want to call it, has been so withered away. And I'm glad Lillian hinged this to our neoliberal moment. And it's hard for me to see how Foucault doesn't participate in that logic. And it seems that we that is something that's so necessary. We need to get over this obsession with ineffable difference and little spots of utopia, and actually being able to say, so what would freedom look like given our situation now? And not assuming that everything will be perfect, but we have to exercise that.
Can I say what I can't forgive Foucault for? I like that.
Absolutely.
What I can't forgive Foucault for is like being the single thinker who has the most uptake in all of academia. And so, like, if anything, you know how there's all this talk about red flags these days. Okay, like it should be in
Foucault in bio.
It should be exactly Foucault in bio, red flag. Like it should be a real red flag that like fucking institutions suck this shit up. They love it. like the dominant institutions of our society, they fucking love this shit. Do you know what I mean? Like
they're handing out discipline and punish on the corner. They're like, "Yo, check out the good word."
Yeah, exactly. Like no, but seriously, like if something is subversive, then people come for it. You know what I mean? Like it's not like it'll be ostracized. It'll be marginalized.
Everyone loves
and the
Foucault.
fact that it is literally still the most cited thinker.
He's the most cited motherfucker from the 20th century.
In the world, right?
Yeah.
From last century, yeah. That's
a red flag.
Red flags, fam.
And then they treat like, and if you do like kind of like have some of these criticisms and it's like, okay, I respect the dude, but like, yeah, there's some neoliberal problems going on here. Then they treat you like an intellectual peasant. Like, oh, you just don't get it. You vulgar motherfucker.
Vulgar.
You know, so.
Yeah.
Look at you trying to subjugate knowledge. Here are the police. Like, oh, I'm the police now.
And half of the people who are trying to come for Foucault are saying goofy nonsense about how he's a CIA op, which is like, what the fuck are you talking about?
That is where this is all going back to
That's
the
ridiculous.
beginning.
Yeah.
Like, that doesn't help you, right?
I mean, there's an important, I think it's always important when someone gets accused of being an op, though, is to like ask yourself, like, okay, you know, maybe they're not necessarily actually, you know, recruited by the CIA. But, like,
I feel like you're giving the CIA too much fucking credit.
I know. But
like everybody, like honestly, like those people are the most incompetent
No, but the
motherfuckers.
question, no, but the question
Imagine
is
being
like,
smart enough to be like, let's pull this French guy over here.
No, but the question is
also,
like, could he be useful to the CIA? Because it makes no difference at a certain point whether the CIA actually recruited him.
Okay, but then you're giving American academics too much credit because then you think that they're like going to be like they had to be duped into like absorbing this stuff into the institutions.
No,
Everybody
it just
lapped
passively
it up.
turns out.
I mean, apparently during the Cold War, there
fit.
was like a cultural wing of like the CIA trying to like go around the world and elevate certain things. Like,
I think Lenin's right though. Like that
abstract
that's
expressionism
his
is apparently
maybe,
an op too.
That might be the case, and also they were just dumb as shit. They were so rock
for
stupid.
sure. Yeah, I'd love picturing a couple CIA agents like by the ENS in Paris, like trying to fucking like pouring through a bunch of Lacan's like lectures and Foucault's history of madness.
Yes.
And trying to be like, you know what? This seems like it'd actually be really useful for undermining the left, which exists in our country at Yale.
Yeah. We gotta undermine the Yale leftists.
Maybe if we tell them that socialism is the real and thus can't be signified. Folks, I think we did it.
We did it. Yeah, they come back to Langley and they're like, we've got a plan.
We got it. We know exactly
President
what to
Nixon, have we got something to tell you?
Oh my God. We don't need McCarthyism anymore. We got a plan.
We have the symbolic and the real.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh man.
Oh man. All right. Well, maybe that's a good spot to end our discussion today. New episodes of What's Left of Philosophy.
That's so good.
Wait. What's going on here?
Keep going. Just go.
Close it out, man. Close it out.
Wait. Should I not close it out yet?
No,
We
it's
can edit
perfect.
this out.
It's perfect.
I'm just thinking about Nixon holding the Acree in his hand.
Yeah, Henry Kissinger's got his copy of Les Moët Choses. Like,
Oh my God, H.W. Bush, man, just walking around with like difference in repetition and
Literally, the Bush family difference and repetition.
That all has to make it into the episode, right? Like,
that's going in. That's going in. Oh my God. Okay, so new episodes of What's Left of Philosophy come out every 2 weeks wherever you get your podcasts. Before closing out today, we'd like to take a minute to thank some of the people who are supporting the show on Patreon. We couldn't do this without you, and we're really grateful. Today's new patrons are Michael Group, Sammy Farhawi, Ol Rausch, Lumu, Paul Goldrick Kelly, Bernard J. Charnley, Graham, David Meesters, Brad Pasanek, Andrew Culp, Mira Maxwell, A Smiley Face, Matthew, Nick Fort, Rose Rowson, ARR, Leo Nicolaitis, Curtis Brown, Sean Young, and Sosation. Thank you all very much. If you like what we're doing and want to support the show, please subscribe to our Patreon at patreon.com/leftofphilosophy. Follow us on Twitter at leftofphil. And don't forget to leave us good reviews and comments in your podcast app, please. So with that, thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.